greet you all from the Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, COP26. In one way, a blah, blah, blah fiesta of political noise, all those fences, that jargon, the backslapping, and the vacuous self-regard. But here's another way to think about it, because all around us, growing louder each year, there is a drumbeat of looming crisis. The disappearance, forever, of beautiful and complicated living things. The vanishing of extraordinary tracts of this planet. Droughts, extreme weather, rising seas. Alok Sharma, president of this summit, says that if we reach 2 degrees of warming, which is the lower end of where we're heading now, 2 billion people will face extreme heat waves and all of the world's coral reefs will die. Now this is also doomy that many of us pretend it isn't happening. But mankind, alongside being a greedy and infuriating species, is a very clever ape. We explore deep space, we're healing the ozone layer, we create new vaccines in a heartbeat. So maybe we are also smart enough and tough enough to turn this around too. Welcome to Glasgow. It's more than blah blah blah. Joined live this morning by the COP26 President, Mr. Sharma, by Labour's Shadow Energy Secretary and former leader, Ed Miliband, and from the front line of climate change by the envoy of the Marshall Islands, Tina Steger. But this conference is attracting protesters as well as politicians, and I sat down earlier this week with Greta Thunberg. Reviewing the news with me in Glasgow this morning is Pippa Crerar, political editor of the Daily Mirror, and Rachel Watson, deputy political editor of the Scottish Daily Mail. But first, the news in Salford comes from Nina Warhurst.
Andrew, thank you. World leaders will be making their way from the G20 summit in Rome to Glasgow today for the start of the COP26 climate conference. Before they set off, Prince Charles will warn them they have an overwhelming responsibility to future generations to fix the climate crisis. Meanwhile, the COP26 climate summit gets underway in Glasgow. More than 25,000 people representing nearly 200 countries will be in attendance. The aim of the two-week event is to commit to measures to limit the rise in global temperatures and cut emissions. Alec Baldwin has described the death of a colleague on the set of his film as a 1 in a trillion episode after he accidentally shot her with a prop gun. Speaking in public for the first time since cinematographer Helena Hutchins died on the set of the Western film Rust, the actor said he would be in favour of limiting the use of firearms on films. He also confirmed production of the movie was unlikely to resume. As pupils return after the half-term break, health teams will visit hundreds of schools across England to offer those aged 12 to 15 a coronavirus vaccine. The Office for National Statistics says the percentage of people testing positive remains highest among school-aged children. Young people are also being urged to take a COVID test before returning to the classroom to minimise the spread and disruption of lessons. That's it from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Many thanks, Nina. And let's concentrate today on the Scottish front pages. There's an entirely different press in Scotland. The Sunday Mail, not connected with the Daily Mail in England, has Greta Mania, a big picture of Greta Thunberg arriving at Glasgow station yesterday and being mobbed. That's on many, many front pages. Scotland on Sunday, same image. World's moment of truth as the climate change summit begins. The Scottish Sun on Sunday, Glas Chance Saloon, it says, and a lot of coverage inside as well. The Sunday National, the independent supporting newspaper, says stop the world, Scotland is on. And then finally we've got the Sunday Post, which is a rather beautifully drawn front page saying it's time, the world turns. And today the world turns to Scotland, it says, at COP, and inside lots of really good coverage again. We'll talk about that later. This is the Scottish edition of the Sunday Times. In the English edition they've gone with their MOD story as the splash, but here it's about Scottish MPs, MSPs, pension funds have got fossil fuel holdings. That will be followed up, I'm sure, today in Scotland. The Observer has been looking at what's been going on in Rome, the summit there, just before this one, where France and the UK have been told, end the dispute, this is the dispute over fishing, or you'll wreck the COP26 summit. And the Sunday Telegraph has the same story. There's the Prime Prime Minister's wife, Carrie, in Rome at the Colosseum. Johnson demands the EU rein in Macron. So an awful lot to talk about. Let's start, Rachel, with you and the coverage of COP, which is why we're here in Glasgow.
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, a lot of the Scottish front pages today have really gone on this pride that Scotland has about hosting COP26. You know, this is the biggest event. We've had so many world leaders coming to Scotland. This doesn't happen very often, and there's a lot of pride, and you see that on the front pages. You mentioned the Sunday Post, which is a really beautiful front page today, and talks about the significance of this event. And you know, Scotland won't be at that the table with the world leaders negotiating, but Nicola Sturgeon is co-host of this Under 2 coalition with other devolved nations, regions and states across the world. So I think there's huge pride, and that's what you see on the front pages, but when you open up the papers, they talk a little bit more about the disruption that will also come to Scotland, because I think there's two sides of this. One, yes, people are very excited to see people like President Joe Biden in Scotland, for example, but also, you know, there's a lot of people whose lives are going to be hampered by this across the next few weeks. There's road closures, for example, quite significantly around the COP26 conference, but also other things. People talk about the disruption right now of this, but there's also concerns. The Sunday Mail have the Clyde Divide as a double-page spread today, talking about not only the disruption but also the mess that they've seen in Glasgow. They have concerns. They're talking about the environment, but they're talking about fly tipping, for example, or rubbish that needs picked up.
There's been a lot of coverage in the press in the run-up to COP about the disgraceful state of Glasgow and how terrible it's looking. And it's not just because I was born not very far away from here. We could tell by the accent, I'm sure. But actually, I was wandering around Glasgow yesterday, and it was absolutely beautiful. It was sunny, it was looking clean, it was busy, it was friendly. There were demonstrations, but they were cheerful and colourful. The city was looking really great.
I think there is, and that's reflected in these papers, that there's been work done on the city centre and around the COP26 venue. There's been a lot of work put in by the council in those areas, but when you read this, you know, they talk about Govan, the other side of the Clyde, where people, you know, are talking about when is this mess, when is the rubbish going to get picked up, when is the fly tipping. As you said, over the last few weeks, you just have to pick up any paper and there's images of the city centre. But this also talks about, the piece in the Sunday Mail talks about the risk of COVID after this, which is concerning people in Glasgow and more widely across the central belt.
Because people have been huddled together so much in hot hotel rooms.
Exactly. There's around 25 to 30,000 people coming to Glasgow. Scotland has struggled over the last couple of months. We've got our figures down, our COVID numbers down, but they've kind of flatlined at the moment at around 2,500 cases a day. So there's now that concern of what will the consequences for Glasgow and Scotland be? Will we face further restrictions because we've hosted this massive conference?
I mentioned the Sunday Post just now. There's a woman called Nan Shepherd who appears in £5 Scottish notes, and she was a great Scottish novelist, poet, and nature writer, and she really features in their analysis, which I thought was supremely good today.
Yeah, I think the Sunday Post has really done a great job on COP, actually. They've got a number of features and analysis pieces in the paper, and this piece on Nan Shepherd as well is actually a really great read for anybody who picks up the paper today, and around her inspiration from Scotland, because this is a chance for Scotland to show off not just Glasgow but the wider country, and talks about her inspiration from the Cairngorms and the mountains of Scotland. So yeah, it's a great read, and there's a great quote from her as well in the paper about the Cairngorms and the water.
Pippa, a lot of your colleagues are in Rome or coming back from Rome. That's where the political class has been gathering for the G20 there, the Pope lecturing them about climate change and so on. And the story in Rome has been as much about the really nasty little local row between Britain and France over fishing as about COP.
That's right. I mean, it was kind of a staging post to this summit, and all eyes internationally are obviously on Glasgow with 120 leaders, not including the leaders of China and Russia and Brazil, it must be said, who are major emitters, coming here. But many of them gathered in Rome, first of all. While there were other things on the agenda, there was women's rights, there was coronavirus vaccines and how you get them spread around the world. A lot of the summit was overshadowed ahead of COP by this row of fishing, which has broken out in the last few days. And it might seem like a very local row, really, because it's ultimately about one trawler and whether it's breached permit rights under the new Brexit agreements for fishing in the Channel. But it's obviously, it obviously demonstrates a much deeper schism between France and the UK. We have President Macron feeling a bit hurt about the August defence row. He's obviously got a presidential election next year, and there's all the rumblings still going on over the Northern Ireland border.
Somebody said to me that relations between Britain and France have not been as bad as politicians saying
Well, Brexit has certainly led to a situation where they're on very, really poor terms. I mean, we saw the images yesterday in Rome of Boris Johnson fist bumping Emmanuel Macron, but, you know, don't be lured into thinking that despite their personal relationship, that the country's relationship is strong at the moment. We've seen this war of words, most recently with David Cross suggesting that they could potentially take action. The Observer talks about how they Britain could trigger the Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which could actually trigger a trade war and potentially months of disputes and talks.
I don't know if we can see any of these pictures, but it has to be said that Boris Johnson produces a good news picture. He looks at one point like he was about to thump Macron. The two of them are confronting each other on the stairs there. It's been a very vivid, but the real danger, of course, is that overshadows what's going on in Glasgow here. And it's interesting because Prince Charles is going to speak to the leaders before they all come here. And he is emphasising something that's important to remember, which is that, you know, we talk about politicians and the public sector, but actually it's private companies and the private sector who are very, very important in changing attitudes and changing behaviour on the climate change.
Yeah, and this comes from another story that's going to be big over the next 2 weeks of the papers, and the fact that the Queen is taking a slight leave from her duties, taking a step back from next week's, won't be at COP26. She's one of the people that we expect to be here, so Prince Charles is going to make this speech tomorrow. And as you say, we expect him to talk about how the private sector and businesses play a role in this, and I think that's something that world leaders, it's something everyone needs to think about, is how we take businesses with us, how we take people with us, because that's one of the biggest challenges for these people who have to make all these decisions on our behalf and say what we're going to do and how they're going to reach these global climate change targets, and the people that they've got to take with them, which are so important, are businesses and the general public in changing those behaviours.
But do you think your readers understand, are just kind of receiving the information from the politicians, or do you think there is a real kind of swelling enthusiasm among Mirror readers and other newspaper readers for the changes that they're going to have to make, you know, changing their heating system, stopping eating so much meat, thinking about driving and flying?
Well, I think one thing that this has done is focus attention on all of those things that you mentioned about people having to make decisions about changing their own lives. I think what our difficulty is always trying to sort of demonstrate to people how all this talk about keeping global temperatures rising just to 1.5 degrees, coal cash cars and trees, I'm sure you'll hear more from Alok Sharma later on all of that, how that relates to their own lives and why it's important that people aren't overstating everything this summit to save the world. The Prime Minister is very downbeat about the chances of limiting the rises of global temperatures. I think there's a lot of big question mark over whether this is going to be the staging post that's needed in order to cut emissions by the middle of the century.
We're going to hear very, very shortly on how the people running this conference think it's going so far, or think it will go. Thank you both very, very much indeed. That very, very interesting. And so, as ever, to the weather. Glasgow is, no, not to the weather, I beg your pardon. Alok Sharma was Boris Johnson's business minister. What I would say about the weather is that Glasgow is known as the dear green place for a very good reason. There's a lot of irrigation, and a lot of irrigation is coming from the sky right now. Now, Alok Sharma was the business minister, but he gave that up for what he thought, rightly, was a much more important job, because he is president of this climate change conference. He describes himself as a kind of global shepherd, herding world leaders for the next few days into, he hopes, an agreement on how to cap global warming. It's a very big task, and he joins me now for heading off to chair the opening ceremony. Nice to see you, Alok Sharma. First of all, the Prime Minister himself said that this, if you failed here, this would be a challenge to of civilization. Civilization would go backwards. Is that an overstatement?
Look, I think the Prime Minister's right. This is a huge challenge that we face collectively, and I would argue that actually what we're trying to achieve here is tougher than what was achieved at Paris. Paris was a great historic agreement, but it was a framework agreement, and a lot of the detailed rules were left to later COPs, and now after 6 years we still have to resolve some of those issues, and of course the geopolitics is also more challenging than at the time of Paris.
In a word, if you fail here, that will be catastrophic.
Well, the world needs to come together and ensure that we are doing our bit to limit global temperature rises.
But
I think it's important to put into context where we have come from. Before Paris, analysts were saying that we were heading towards 6 degrees of global warming. After Paris, that temperature curve was bent below 4 degrees. And if you look at recent reports from the International Energy Agency, for instance, they tell us that because of the commitments that have been made in the last year or so, that temperature curve has been bent towards 2 degrees. So there has been progress, but of course there's more to do.
The real figure, the
tough, as I said, and what countries are calling for, and I know you're going to be talking to others as well about this in this programme, but what they're saying is that if we look at all the commitments that have been made, and I said we're heading towards 2 degrees, how is it that over this next decade, indeed over the next few years, we close that gap so that we get closer to 1.5? And that's something that I'm going to have to try and build consensus on at this conference.
The UN says that at the moment we're heading to 2.7 degrees. You yourself have said that would mean 1 billion people facing really, really severe heat and the death of all the planet's global coral reefs. That would be catastrophic. That's where we're going now. So I say to you again, we'll be really interested. Do you think you can limit this to 1.5 degrees in Glasgow or not?
Well, first, just if I may say, the 2.7 degrees that we've talked about relate to the 2030 emission reduction targets. If they don't take into account all the net zero commitments that have been made. And I would just say, Andrew, that when we took this thing on, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. We're now over 80%, most of the G20, in fact, have signed up to net zero commitments. So if you take all of that into account, we're heading towards 2 degrees. But I agree with you. We need to make sure that we are heading lower than that. And that's why we need to ensure that we get an agreement with Scotland.
I'll be talking in a moment to the climate envoy of the Marshall Islands, and she says that anything above 1.5 degrees is utterly catastrophic for her community and her country. I ask you for the third time, do you think we can hold this to 1.5 degrees at this conference? More or less, yes or no?
As you said in your introduction, my job is effectively to act as shepherd in chief. This is on leaders. It was leaders who made the commitment in Paris. It's leaders of the biggest economies meeting now at the G20, and they need to come forward. And collectively, we need to agree how we're going to address this gap. And you talk about Tina's right. There are countries that I have visited around the world where 1.5 would be absolutely catastrophic for them. We already have a situation where millions of lives and livelihoods are being impacted because of rising climate, because of climate change. We see that in every country around the world. And the one thing I can tell you is that every country I've spoken to understands that climate change does not recognise borders. And that's why we need to act together.
Let's talk about some of the leaders in the countries that you've been to, because China announced its proposals, and in the view of an awful lot of people, it's to take things much further than after Paris. And yet, talking to people around here, talking to some of the lobbyists and the campaigners and so on, there is a growing feeling that the Chinese are engaging a bit more than we expected. Are they persuadable?
Well, look, I had constructive discussions with China when I was there in September. I've met some of their team already in the last few days. Now, in terms of their NDC, it moved forward somewhat from 2015 in terms of latest NDC, but of course we expected more. And this is a real opportunity for China, for all the biggest economies, to step up and show further leadership here. I mean, China's made some commitments in terms of coal. They've said, and I think this really is very meaningful, that they will stop international coal financing. And they've also said that in terms of domestic coal, that will start to go down from 2026. We need to see the details of that.
Do you think we're going to see more commitments from China?
Well, I want to see more commitments from all countries here, but ultimately this will come down to what we're able to negotiate. And the key issue, Andrew, as you pointed out, is that how do we ensure that we limit global temperatures to 1.5 to keep 1.5 alive?
Let me ask you about one other very important country, the world's second largest emitter, which is the United States. Now, President Biden has this big $500 trillion plan, but that is stuck in Congress. He wants to limit oil and gas exploration, but it's really stuck in the American courts. Can I ask you directly, do you think gridlock in the American political system is a threat to this conference?
Well, I've spent a lot of time talking to John Kerry and others in the US system, and I think they recognise the fact that we need to get this over the line. And look, I'm very pleased that we have an administration in the US now which is totally focused on climate change. They've come forward with further commitments on finance, and so absolutely we need to ensure the US system, just like every other system, delivers for the planet.
So we've talked about China and the United States. The world's third biggest emitter, India, doesn't even have a 1.5 or zero carbon target at all. Are we going to see that from India at this conference?
Well, we'll have to wait and see what Prime Minister Modi says. What I would say to you is that India has made great strides in terms of renewables. They've got a commitment of 450 gigawatts in terms of renewables by 2030. What I would like to see is for that to come forward in terms of their 2030 emission reduction target.
Can you possibly get to 1.5 degrees as the maximum level of heating if India doesn't agree to net zero?
Well, we need
In that spirit, can I ask you about the Cambo oil and gas field to the west of Shetland, which is waiting for the go-ahead from this government? Do you think it will help Britain show that moral authority if you allow that oil and gas field to go ahead? Yes or no?
Well, Andrew, I mean, it's worth setting out where we've actually got to. So,
I'm sorry, I'm asking you about Cambo.
And I want to put that in context. We as a country have decarbonised our economy faster than any other G20 nation over the past years. And in terms of oil and gas, we've been very clear. We've said that in terms of granting any future licences, there will be a climate compatibility checkpoint, and any licences that are granted will have to be compatible with our legal requirement to be net zero by 2050.
Sure, the International Energy Agency says that to reach net zero by 2050, no new oil and gas fields can be approved for development from this year. Surely you have it in your power to stop that development. Why won't you?
Well, it is not, as you say, in my power. My role here is to bring together consensus amongst 200 countries.
But it's the government's power.
What I said to you, that in terms of the IEA report, what they also made clear that even in a net zero scenario, there is some element of oil and gas in that. But of course, what I want to see is us doing even more renewables as we have done over the past decade.
I ask again, does allowing the Cambo oil and gas field off Shetland to go ahead now set a good example around the world?
And Andrew, what I would say to you is that that is something that is being considered. There was a consultation inquiry around all of that. I'm not going to go into that particular issue. When there is an announcement and agreement, of course, I'm very happy to come back and talk to you. My job, Andrew, is to pull together almost 200 parties and try and reach agreement here at this conference.
But people are looking to you to set an example. Now, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, Lord Demon, former government, says of the oil and gas field Cambo that I've been describing, he says once you do that, once you like to go ahead, you set an example that will be quoted throughout the world as showing such a development is acceptable. And yet you're not prepared to stop it.
Well, as I said, that's not my decision, that's not my role.
It's your government's decision.
Well, yes, and as I said to you, when a decision is made, I'm very happy to come back and discuss it. Since you mentioned the Committee on Climate Change, they've also said that the net zero strategy that we have produced is a landmark strategy globally, and it's one that I think other countries will look at and take heed of.
And if I was a country looking for a way out, loophole here, I'd say, look at Cambo, they're not even prepared to stop that.
Well, should we wait and see what the decision is?
We shall. Okay, well, let me talk about another thing. Your colleague George Eustace has said the government is looking at taxing high-carbon foods. He means in particular meat and probably in particular beef. When are we going to see the details of that?
Well, look, I mean, issues related to tax and spend are for the Chancellor, and we'll see what comes forward. I've been very clear that on a personal level, I'm someone who believes very much in carrot rather than steak, trying to encourage people to move in that direction.
So do you think we should all be eating less meat as our part of our contribution to climate change?
That's a personal choice. What we need to make sure as the government is that we are incentivising people to make decisions in the same way that we have grants to support people to buy ultra-low emission vehicles. We've got the boiler money that has now been announced as well in terms of replacing the boilers with heat pumps. That, I think, is the way that you help people and support them make those decisions.
One last area. Back in 2009, the developed countries agreed a $100 billion a year sum to go to the countries right on the front line threatened by climate change right now. When are they going to see that money?
So I asked colleagues in Germany if they could put together a delivery plan. I think we can say with some confidence that in 2023 that 100 billion will come through, perhaps even earlier. And actually, over that period, 2021 to 2025, I think we can say with some confidence that we will go to over 500 billion over that 5-year period. But of course, there will be further discussions on financing. The top countries are particularly interested in money for adaptation, the balance between adaptation and mitigation, and the whole issue of access to finance. So what I would say is that we have made progress, but there is more to do. And I just say at this point, is that we've got the G20 gathering now, having this discussion in Italy. Those leaders will come here over the next few days. And what I would say to them, today is Halloween, what I would say to them is that please, let's leave the ghosts of the past, exercise the ghosts of the past, leave those in the past, let's build a better future together, because the one issue that we can absolutely all unite around is protecting our planet.
Oh, Sharma, you've got a very busy day. Thanks very much indeed for coming in and talking with me just now. And so to the weather. I mentioned earlier how Glasgow was reported to be a filthy and chaotic host for this conference. But yesterday, the city, I promise you, was looking magnificent, sparkling, and more sun splashed than the rain splashed. Now, sadly, that at least has not lasted. So what next for here and for the rest of the country? Over to Sarah Keith-Lucas in the Weather Centre. Sarah.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, you're not alone there in Glasgow seeing the wet weather this morning. Many of us woke up to quite a damp start to the day, and really through the course of the day it's going to be a mix. Some tricks and some treats thrown in. Certainly more wet weather to come through the course of the day. Windy too, but it's going to clear its way eastwards. For most places there'll be a return to some sunshine through the day. So low pressure driving our weather at the moment. Winds rotating of this area of low pressure. This is the weather front that's bringing all the rain this morning. It's clearing northwards and eastwards gradually, but it will linger longest for the north and east of Scotland. So here's quite persistent rain. Could be a few flooding problems. Most places seeing a return to sunny spells and a few scattered showers on into the afternoon, with top temperatures around about 10 to 15 degrees, a little bit cooler than it has been lately. Into the evening hours, still further showers rattling through on this brisk breeze. Overnight, more persistent rain mixes across the northwest of Scotland and Northern Ireland too. Temperatures overnight getting down into single figures, but it will be a frost-free start to the first day of November tomorrow. So Monday then, still some sunny spells, still some scattered showers around, but it's really for the west of Scotland and northwest England we're going to see the most persistent rain. Flood warnings are still in force in a few regions too, and it's not as warm as it has been recently, with top temperatures around 9 to 14 degrees.
Now, earlier on I mentioned the Marshall Islands, Alok Sharma. They are a collection of small volcanic islands in the central Pacific Ocean, just between Hawaii and the Philippines. Just under 60,000 people live there. For the most part, you don't hear much about what's happening on those islands, but they are central to what we understand about climate change. Earlier on this morning, I caught up with the very busy Tina Steggy, the climate envoy of the Marshall Islands, who was here with the world leaders gathering for COP.
My country is made up of atoms. You think of an island, maybe Hawaii comes to mind, big mountains, lush forests. Atoll islands are beautiful, but extremely small. We have lagoons. It's just a necklace of islands around a lagoon, and on the other side is the ocean. Essentially, it's all ocean. We're one long coastline. It's a nation of coastlines.
So you're very close to the ocean. What happens to the Marshall Islands if we do see global warming of 2 degrees or more, which is where we're heading for at the moment?
To be honest, 2 degrees, anything beyond 1.5 is unimaginable for us. My islands are just 2 meters above sea level. There's no higher ground than that. At 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase, we're looking at global sea level rise of around half a meter, and that creates inundations on a yearly basis. Beyond 1.5 degrees, it really is unthinkable. 1.5 is our line that we cannot cross.
I'll just come back to that, but you've seen some effect of global warming on the Marshall Islands already, have you? Can you just tell us a little bit about what's happened so far?
Well, we're seeing longer and more intense droughts, which is a huge problem for us because we rely on rainwater, really. We used to rely on well water, but with sea level rise that's already happened, many of our wells have turned brackish, and so now we have to collect rainwater in order to have water to drink. So we're already seeing those effects. At very high tides, we're already seeing water that literally bubbles up through the ground. So it's happening now. We're trying to think about what we can do to adapt and survive in longer term. And we're putting in place plans, but we really need to do that with the help of the rest of the world.
So you're seeing the sea levels come at the moment. Is there anything you can actually do practically to protect yourselves at the moment in terms of sea walls and so forth?
Yeah, we're really focused right now on our national adaptation plan, which we're calling our survival plan. And there's going to be things that we have to adapt to in the nearer term, nature-based solutions. Some of those will work, but in the longer term, we're going to have to really have transformative adaptation, not just looking at the elevation of buildings, but potentially the elevation of land, so that we can have some secure place for our people to continue to live.
So literally building up parts of the islands higher?
Yes.
Now, I'm sorry to bring you back to what you said was unimaginable, 2 degrees or 2.7. People argue about where we're heading for at the moment. If that happens, do you literally lose the Marshall Islands completely?
We do not accept that we are going to lose this fight. We can't accept that. We are going to fight to protect our territory, to protect our people, and that is what I'm here to do. That is what my entire government is focused on, is ensuring that we have a safe and secure place for our people. And I really want to say that, we are on the front lines of the crisis. We're going to be hit earliest and hardest, but this crisis is going to affect us all. And if you protect those who are on the front lines, you really protect yourself and your
behind
children.
the front lines
yes.
as well.
And I think we really learned that with COVID.
You are clearly going to need to build a lot of new protections, almost whatever happens. It's a big question about who should pay for that, because clearly Marshall Islanders, there's only, 60,000 of you altogether, you can't pay for it yourselves.
No, we absolutely can't. And we're really looking to our partners to really understand the grave situation that we're in. As I said, we're all going to need to adapt, but those who are the larger, wealthier nations, who have really created the problem in the first place, unfortunately, have the resources to respond. We do not. And we have to work with our partners to be able to respond to this crisis and secure our future.
Thinking of people at home in Britain wondering about whether Britain should be, as it were, paying to help the Marshall Islands. We used to have 40% of our energy coming from coal. It's now down to 1.8%. In other words, Britain's doing quite a lot. People will look around and think, well, hold on a second. China is responsible for 28% of CO2 emissions at the moment. Surely they should be paying. What would you say to people having that argument in their heads at the moment?
What I say is that this is a global problem. We all have to do more. And, we're a very small nation, but we have taken this to heart, and we're really have led by example. We were the first nation to submit enhanced targets. We have very robust plans in place to switch our own energy systems to renewable energy. We're working very hard right now on our national adaptation plan, which I think every country in the world needs to do. And so I think what I would say is, we lead by example. If we can do it, so can everyone else in the world, whether it's China, Britain, or particularly all the nations of the G20 who are really counting on to make the key difference for all of us.
Way back in 2009, there was an agreement from the richer countries of the world, two countries on the front line, allocating about 100 billion, I think, a year in terms of dollars to countries like yours. Have you seen any of that money?
It's been really difficult, actually, particularly for all the island states. It's very hard to access these very large funds. As you said, we're a nation of 60,000, and I come from a department working on climate that numbers in the tens. And it's a lot of reporting, it's a lot of applications, and so access is a huge issue, but also just the quantity of the funds. I think we know that it hasn't been met, that commitment hasn't been met. We're not at the 100 billion now. There's a delivery plan out there about how we're going to get there, and we need to see more.
I think a lot of people are still trying to focus on how important this moment in Glasgow is. Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, who's got a certain reputation for exaggeration, put it that way, has said that this is a last chance to save civilization. For the Marshall Islanders, is that literally true?
This is a hugely important COP. My country has actually been locked down since February of 2020 with no travel outside by any government officials. This is the first time that our government has come outside, and it's for this COP, because we recognize that it is a hugely important moment. It's the moment at which we have to face squarely the fact that we're not on track. There are huge gaps. There's a huge gap. We're not on track to 1.5. This is a moment where we can keep it in sight. We have that opportunity, particularly if the biggest emitters come forward and put new targets on the table and concrete actions that can actually meet those targets. We need to see the ending of fossil fuel subsidy. Coal needs to go. These are the actual actions that can make the difference. And so it's at this COP that we can reaffirm what we promised in Paris, that 1.5 is the road to a safe, secure future.
Tina Steggy of Marshall Islands there. Now, with me now in Glasgow, the Labour Party's Shadow Energy and Business Secretary and former leader, Ed Miliband, who was negotiating in Copenhagen.
We can always prevent things from getting worse. It's never too late to do as much as we can.
Greta Thunberg, thanks very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for watching, and thanks to all my guests. I'll be back next week at 9 a.m. on BBC One. Until then, pull on your wellies and have a good weekend. Goodbye.